Alrighty. Oy, oy. Okay. Let's get started here. Okay, so I guess a couple of really quick things to just to mention. So obviously, as I said last week, and I sent an email out last week about it, last week's labs were canceled and moved to this week. So there is a lab this week, right? So Celine will be there today. I think it's 2 to 4, and tomorrow I don't remember the times, honestly. Whatever the times are, she'll be there, and she's ready to go with that. So yeah, labs today for all y'all. And okay, so your mini lab number 4 is marked. I put everything else on pause and stayed up till like 1 in the morning so I could get through all of them and finish them up this morning. So those are all done, and I've given you a little bit of feedback on those. So that should be all good. The major lab, sometime this week. It's now, I've moved enough stuff out now that it's now focus number 1. I got 2, I got this, and I got a midterm in SOS 376 to mark. So I am now on full-time marking your major lab. So hopefully next couple days I'll get it back. Hopefully before Thursday. I'm sorry it's taken so long. Just so much stuff has come in, and have to triage and occasionally sleep once in a while. So maybe. And yeah. Anyway, I am really looking forward to reading week. Not because I won't be working, but because I can work in my pajamas. Okay. So, any questions before I jump in on anything? Anything anyone wants to ask? Okay, everyone's good. I believe so. Yeah, typically, I think that's what I said. So I rarely see this room when everyone's here, and it was actually very full when all 50 people were here. I might be able to request a different one if it's too packed, but we'll see. Sorry, Yana. Okay. You looked like you had a question. Desperately no. Okay. Any other questions? I'll make sure that we double check Soha before that date. All that fun stuff. No, okay, all right. So what were we talking about last time? We were talking about focus groups, right? Just kind of to catch you up. So basically, focus groups are just basically interviews with a group of 4 or more people, right? Who can interact with each other and the interviewer, right? And I sort of talked about, what's the value of this? It's that, people can say things in the focus group that trigger other people's ideas, right? Their memories, they add on. So it can be a very kind of collaborative process of kind of answering your questions rather than you just one-on-one. Now, you sacrifice depth sometimes for breadth in terms of focus groups, right? Because you could get really, if you did a 1-hour interview with someone, you're going to get a lot more depth of their experience than if they're just telling you things in a focus group where they're 1 of 4, 1 of 6, 1 of 8, 1 of 10. And there's a lot of, practical challenges with focus groups, getting people to show up being among them. Okay. As the kind of researcher, typically you're playing the role of moderator or facilitator, and this is kind of guiding the conversation, asking the questions that you want answered, and making sure everybody has a chance to speak, whether that's with, some kind of tool like a speaker stick or you're just guiding the conversation, right? You want to make sure that everybody has a chance to participate, but no one is forced to participate, right? If people just don't have anything to say, you just kind of leave it at that. But you want to make sure everyone has a chance, and that, because there's always 2 or 3 people that are going to dominate a focus group because they just have big personalities and lots to say. And they might, it would be potentially beneficial to make sure that other people also have a chance to speak because they might have interesting things to contribute as well. So that we'll leave it there. Okay. I guess, we talked about this as well, that this idea researchers should do 10 to 15 focus groups. I tend to think that that's a lot. It's going to depend, I think, on your resources, your time, the topic you're looking at, and when you reach saturation, right? When you kind of hit that point where you can predict what will be said, you might not need 10 focus groups if you hit saturation after 5, right? Or 6 or 3, right? But, it's a very, I think, I see your hand, iterative process, and I think one that can use a lot of adaptation. Yeah, Mia. Okay, yeah. So basically, to hit theoretical saturation, it basically means that you're not finding out anything new, right? That there's no new information or themes that are coming out of your focus groups, right? Or you do this with ethnography sometimes too. This is kind of one of the principles of grounded theory, is that you can stop, kind of revising your hypothesis when you're not learning anything new, right? When your existing kind of explanations cover everything. In focus groups, once people aren't saying anything novel or interesting or surprising, right? It's like, okay, I've heard all of these things before from my previous focus groups. Then you can sort of, say we've probably hit the point where we've hit theoretical saturation. We're not going to learn anything substantially new by doing more of these, right? Because we've covered all the ground we need to cover. Does that make sense? Okay, perfect. Yeah, okay. And I guess this is where we ended off. And I did say that this can be really complicated for lots of logistic reasons. Depending on the topic and the goal of the research, right, it can affect how big your group's going to be. Like, say you're talking about something that's very personal, you might want, in some senses, it says here, controversial, complex, and emotional topics, you might want a smaller group. You might actually also want a bigger group, right? So that people can sort of melt in, right? If something gets uncomfortable, they're not one of like 4 people you have in the focus group. They can kind of pull back a little bit and they feel a little bit more anonymous in the group. So they're more okay with saying stuff. You really have to judge based on your topic and there's no unfortunately, qualitative research is the kind of thing where, well, there are handbooks and there are kind of best practices. There's no one size fits all approaches, right? And so you have to kind of judge what kind of situation you're in. And sometimes you might have to change your approach in the middle of a project, right? If you're finding that, say, you were talking about, I don't know why you would do this in a focus group, but let's say you were talking about sexual abuse, right? And you convene focus groups to talk about sexual abuse, and you find that people just won't talk because it's too intimate, right? And they feel too exposed and vulnerable. You might want to go with a bigger group, right? You might shift your approach midway to a bigger group, which can be challenging too. Yeah, I mean, small groups, obviously, they can be much more intimate. They can be much more, I guess intimate is the word I want to use, and I just want to keep using the same word over and over again. But obviously, right, if people feel more comfortable with each other, they're a little bit smaller. People sometimes will reveal things in more kind of open ways. They might not feel as intimidated by a big number of people. So there's that there, and you really do have to judge it, based on your kind of intuition, and then kind of test it out and see how it goes. This recommendation of, from Morgan of 6 to 10 people, I think kind of makes sense, right? For the most part, 6 to 10 people is going to be a good size. I think 6 is better than 10, but like I said last time, you sometimes have to over-recruit for focus groups because there's always going to be, on the day of your focus group, 1 to 5 people that decide that actually this is not my cup of tea and don't show up. Yeah, Mia.
Are there any benefits to larger
I mean, you have more voices, right? So you hear more perspectives. It does allow people a little bit more anonymity, right? So they're not necessary, especially, like I said, on some subjects that might be very personal. They're not the center of all the attention. They can put in their couple of comments and their perspective and then sort of almost be a wallflower, sink back into the background. So that anonymity can be really good. I mean, just on a practical level, Inviting more people probably means a better chance that enough people will show up. And I mean, I think you weren't here, but I was saying last time that in focus groups that I did, I invited 10 people. And in one focus group, I had all 10 people show up, which was a little bit much. And then in the next one, I think that very same day, I had 4 people show up, right? Out of 10. Because 6 people canceled at the last minute or just ghosted me. And that was okay. So yeah, I mean, sometimes the bigger focus groups and planning a bigger focus group means that you'll still have enough people show up, but also, yeah, broader perspective and a chance for people to pull back a little bit if they're feeling uncomfortable, which can help. Yeah, Chloe.
Would you recommend using focus groups over one-on-one interviews?
It-
Or like which would you
It
choose?
entirely depends on the circumstances and what kind of information you want to find out, right?
Like if it's more like personal life experiences, like which would be better to use?
There's a case to be made for both, right? Like, I mean, you're definitely going to get a lot more depth, right? If you can interview people, they can tell you their whole life story, right? You know, I was born in a log cabin in the mountains in 1842. You know, I'm kidding, of course. You know, born in 1490 in the Highlands of Scotland, and I'm still alive. That's the plot of Highlander. It's a movie. So you can get a lot, like you can get their whole life story, whereas in a focus group, you're going to get snippets, right? You're going to get little pieces, opinion on this, opinion on that. Focus groups, though, sometimes can open up people's perspectives a little bit more, where, you know, the thing that Joe said gets Brandy thinking about this particular thing, and she didn't remember necessarily that she had that perspective, but then she sort of adds on. So they can build in different ways. I mean, I think a lot of the time, focus groups end up being really useful when you're time constrained and budget constrained. I mean, a very practical level, you can do them much more quickly, right? Like in 2 days, if you're really a masochist, you can do 6 focus groups, right? And you can have covered like, you know, 60 people in theory, whereas to interview 60 people is going to take you 6 months, right? But yeah, Mia.
Would there be a benefit of doing both a focus group and one-on-one interviews, or is it kind of redundant?
Okay, I mean, it's an interesting question. You might, now the ethics on this might be a little hard to do, but there might be instances where, say, you find someone in a focus group, right? And you realize during the focus group that they have a really interesting perspective, right? Or that you really want to know more. And then you could invite them to do a one-on-one interview to get more kind of, you know, if what comes out in the focus group is like, oh man, this person has really interesting experiences of this, and I could get a lot of information from interviewing them, you could, you know, then invite them to do interviews. That would be the direction that I think it would make the most sense. Going from interviews to focus groups, I think makes less sense, right? Unless the interviews are like a pilot study. Like, I guess, okay, you could do like, I don't know anything about this topic, right? I don't know anything about being a furry at all. So I'm going to like recruit 5 furries on Reddit r/furry. I assume that's a thing. I've never checked. And try to interview them, right? And that might give me some like themes, right? Some general kind of ideas with which I could then build out my focus groups. That would be the way that, like, if you're going from interviews to focus groups, that's the way I think it would make sense. And maybe as a kind of like recruitment tool, like trying to access a particular community through those interviews so you can then build your focus groups. There are, of course, there are issues with that too, in that if you're recruiting a whole bunch of people that know each other in a focus group, then there's a lot of reactivity that can happen. It's better if it's strangers. But there's not, again, unfortunately with qualitative research, there isn't always a clear-cut answer. I can see a case for doing it. I think the case is stronger to go from focus group to interview than interview to focus group, unless you honestly are just kind of like trying to get a lay of the land before you step into your main research activity. But does that kind of make sense?
Why would it be like iffy on the ethics if you do like focus groups
Well, it's only that if you'd have to have proposed it in advance, right? Or you'd have to go and revise your ethics. Because if you're saying, I'm going to do focus groups, you can't then, under the ethics kind of letter or permission that you have, just be like, oh, and I'm going to do interviews, right? You'd have to go, you probably wouldn't have trouble with it, but it is something that you, before you could do that interview, you would have to go back to the ethics board and say, hey, I found some really interesting candidates that I think I would benefit from interviewing as part of my research process. Can I add interviews to my project, right? Chances are they'd say yes, but I mean, even I'll put it this way. At one point, when I was doing a project that was all interviews, I was like, okay, I did my 20 interviews. I'd like to do more, right? I think I could benefit from doing maybe 10 more interviews. I had to take that back to research ethics. I had to revise my ethics because I had said, I'm going to do 20. So I had to go back to ethics, and they said no. They're like, no, we think you've done enough, right? So ethics boards can be weird that way. But you couldn't just, unless you proposed it initially, that you're going to do, I mean, I guess you could put this in. I never thought about it when I was doing it, to be like, hey, I'm going to do focus groups. And if I find interesting people, then I might follow up with maybe 20 interviews, right? You could build it in. If you haven't built it in, you got to go back and propose a revision. And then you got to risk that the ethics board is going to shoot you down, unfortunately, because that's how it goes. Does that make sense, though? Yeah, ethics boards are weird. They're kind of futzy. Is that another question, Chloe? Or okay, just fixing your hair. Okay. All right. Did I say everything that's on this slide? I don't know anymore. They're good questions. I guess I need to keep an eye on the time. Okay. Now I see after like the switch to or whatever we're in, daylight saving, I think. I don't trust any clock anywhere anymore because I'm like, I don't know that they have the right time. Okay. Oh, right. So this is just this comes from the textbook, right? And it's just kind of a like focus group size and number of groups, right? Basically, just looking at kind of what other people have done in the past. Aha, there's my pen. And you can see, right, like there's a huge variation. There's really no, I think, no really specified like hard rule that you can draw from this. It's very dependent on kind of what, I think what's available to you and what you can do. This one is my favorite, by the way. Froelich et al. Number of groups simply not specified in the research they wrote up. I'm like, cool. And how many size of group? Probably 12. It's just like, okay. Interesting way of going about this. A contextual understanding of pre-adolescent smoking behavior. I don't know how many groups I did, and I don't know how many people were in them. I did not keep good records, is my takeaway. Yeah, I mean, sometimes, people don't specify. Though you really should, and every paper you write should have a method section that kind of spells all of this out. Right, again, right, so here, bisexual people's experience of mental health services, they did 8 focus groups of 3 to 9, and I almost guarantee exactly what I'm saying. When they did 3, they invited 10 and 3 people showed up, right? So this happens all the time. And with 9, they invited 10 and 9 people showed up, right? And yeah, so you see this again here, right? Let et al. 5 to 10, probably 10 invited, 5 show up. And you see this kind of across the board. That's a big group. 15 people. And again here, my guess would be you're probably inviting 15 people, hoping that 10 will show up. And in one case, 15 people showed up. So I hope your room was big enough. That kind of stuff happens, right? But there is no like hard and fast rule like why, bisexual people's experience with mental health services should require 8 groups, not the 10 to 12 that were recommended. And why this one? I mean, man, this must have taken a while. Audience responses to media messages about AIDS, 52 focus groups of between 3, 9, and 10. That's a huge study. I mean, I did one when I was doing my master's. I can see how this would happen. What was it? It was something. It was about climate change. It was a worldwide views of climate change. So they invited people from across Canada to Calgary. They flew them in from all over the country, including Quebec. And basically, like, the entire ballroom at the Fairmont Palliser in Calgary was just full of tables, and we were running, like, must have been 25, 30 focus groups at the same time, right? So it's a great big schmozzle. That's probably what you're looking at there, right? It's a big, audience media messages on AIDS. That's probably like someone doing big research for, I would guess, probably a government agency too, given what it is, right? And they just like rented out a ballroom and had like 40 focus groups running at once or something like that. Yeah, so like I said, there's no hard and fast rule. Who's included is all based on the research question, right? The criteria, if any, right? Age, sexual orientation, that's what they're looking for. 4 groups out of 32 Quebec communities, that's all. Yeah, anyway, you can read all this, right? Based on what they're kind of looking at is what they had. Experience of violence, Scottish/English ethnicity and class. That must have been an interesting study. Responses of women to watching violence. That is a weird focus group. Okay. Nevertheless, right? You get the idea that there are no rules. There are only recommendations. And so you just kind of have to figure out when you're doing this, what's going to work based on your available resources. Like if you've got a team, you could probably do more, right? You could probably do, I don't know if you could do 52, maybe you can do 8, maybe you can do 14. If you're doing it like I was, you're doing them like all this research alone, then you're probably not going to be able to do that as much, right? So you might have to be like, I'm doing this project alone because I'm a master's student. I have SSHRC funding, but it only goes so far. Or, I got someone to fund my research, but I only have 6 months to complete it, and this is my budget. So sometimes you have to sort of deal with that. Yeah, please.
So if you have multiple people running focus groups, is there still that interviewer variability there?
There definitely is, yeah. So I mean, okay, so you're asking me to go back a long time. Oh, because Worldwide Views would have been in 2008 when I was still doing my master's at U of C. So we did 2 days of training, right? Where we basically were in a big conference room at the U of C because it was a project run out of U of C. And basically we did 2 days, 2 full days of training, basically going over the questions, practicing how you manage a focus group. So you try to limit that again with training, right? So you want to make sure that your inter sort of interviewer or moderator variability is as small as possible, right? And we had people checking around at the tables, right? Kind of going around and checking how things were going and kind of sitting in briefly. But yeah, there's always that possibility that one person's going to be asking things in a different way. The only way you can kind of try and reduce that is with training. But even if you have the same person, right, doing these interviews or these focus groups, you can still get an intra-interviewer kind of variability, especially if, say, as you progress, you're learning things, right? So on the first focus group, you're probably really close to your script. By the time you get to maybe your 6th focus group, you've probably picked up a lot of interesting kind of information along the way, and you might start to kind of integrate that into what you're saying. It's a natural process, and I guess you just have to be reflexive about it and be like, my 6th focus group was quite different from my first one because I'd picked up all of this information along the way, right? And things like fatigue too. At a certain point, your 3rd 2-hour focus group of the day, you're just like, okay, what do you want to say now? I don't care about anything anymore. My brain is dead. And you just try to, fuel it with coffee and, muffins, I think is mostly what you do. Always buy very sweet muffins, high sugar stuff to get your brain back in shape for 2 minutes. I swear, carb load. I know it sounds stupid, but carb load before your focus groups, it helps. Any other questions? They're good questions. I know this chart is confusing. It's are there no rules? There aren't hard and fast rules. That's some of the fun of qualitative work, is that there aren't hard and fast rules. You can be, I don't want to say loosey-goosey, because that sounds like I'm 3. But you can definitely be a little bit more creative. I have small children, I'm sorry. Whoop-de-doo, right? But there's definitely a lot more fun to be had, I think, sometimes. I know, the quant guys are going to jump down my throat if they ever hear this. Because I've done both, but I'm really much more of a qualitative researcher. I think it's way more fun because you can be much more flexible and you can be much more adaptable than say, well, now I'm going to run this linear regression. Haha, aren't I clever? I'm sure that's all quantitative researchers do is run linear regressions and wear tweed. That's my impression. Okay, so, selecting participants. Natural groups. Okay, so natural groups basically are people who already know each other, and I was kind of saying there can be some downsides to this, right? Or already have some interactions. Yeah, natural groups, right? Depending on what you're doing, they might be inevitable, right? If you're looking at, like, I don't know, formerly incarcerated persons, right? There's an outside chance that, you're going to get people that know each other, right? If we're wanting to do, I don't know, say like gang research or furry research or something like that, or within a religious group, right? Or within a community, right? You want to find out about the experiences of Somali Canadians, right? And some of the challenges they face in their own words, right? You're probably drawing from this kind of natural group and they may know each other, right? Yeah, I mean, so it might be appropriate depending on the goals and useful, if you want to see how people interact socially. If you want to talk about like social and power dynamics, you can get a good look at it in a focus group. Like if there is, I don't know, like in gang research, you're going to know very quickly who's in charge, right? And who's up in the kind of gang. I don't know how you would get gang members to do a focus group, but let's pretend life is magical. I'm sure there's a way. I'm sure someone has done it. I just can't imagine what that looks like. The disadvantage is obviously that, the pre-existing interactions and status hierarchies are going to affect the discussion. And certainly, like, if people are afraid that something they're going to say might get back into the community, right, and might affect their social status negatively, this might cause them to sort of clam up in some ways, right? They might not be as honest as you might like them to be, simply because they're kind of on their guard because they're amongst people that they know, and there are ramifications to saying certain things, right? If you want to do a focus group on kind of Roman Catholics and how they feel about the church, it's probably best not to invite a priest, right? Because they're simply not going to be as honest, right? They're going to be like, yes, but Father so-and-so, I don't want it to get back to him, so I'm not going to talk, right? When I did research on Catholics, no priests were allowed within like 100 miles of the research. I was like, no, there will be no prayer. There will be no blessings. You guys are not allowed to even be in the building the day I'm doing this. Seriously, those were my rules. Okay. Yeah, the group might have taken for granted assumptions that are not challenged, right? If everybody is from the same kind of perspective, right, because they all belong to the same group, you might not, they're all furries, right? So they all enjoy being furries. They all have, the same perspective on it. They might not see how odd it seems from the outside. You might not get, that broader perspective because they just have assumptions that they all share. And so it can kind of limit it. And it's kind of like, the insider-outsider problem, whenever you're doing, say, ethnographic research. It's like if you're an insider, you have more depth of knowledge as to what's going on, but you're sort of bound with the assumptions of the group that you're in a lot of ways. If you're an outsider, you don't get as much depth because you don't understand the inner workings of a group, but as an outsider, you can be more critical of what's going on. And the same thing here, right? People are often uncritical of things that happen in their own group because lots of things are simply taken for granted. Okay. I guess, I should say not natural groups. The other possibility, right, is sort of more of a convenience or snowball sample in terms of who you get. right? You have a specific topic that you're interested in, and you sort of recruit and you take, essentially people who are interested. Now, there's, of course, I will say this, there's always screening that goes on, right? You're never just going to have someone who says, yes, I will be part of your focus group, and then you don't ask any further questions. And this can be tempting because sometimes, right, getting people to participate in stuff can be really hard. And so you might just be happy to have a warm body. But always you'll want to have a few questions to make sure the person actually fits your criteria. Like when I was recruiting people to do these focus groups on kind of Catholic institutions, I honestly had people who didn't live in Edmonton, right? So I was just interested in Edmonton. And I had people who said, I'll participate. I'm like, oh, do you live in Edmonton? No, I live in Calgary. I'm like, well, this is not useful to me, right? Or how long have you lived here? Oh, I've lived here for 2 months. Well, they're not going to have any depth of experience of Catholic institutions in Edmonton if they've been here for 2 months. Yeah, Mia. Yeah, I sometimes you might do this and like, okay, you get one person and you're like, hey, do you know anyone else who might be interested? Probably more of a convenience sample would be more what I'm meaning, right? Just like you put out an ad on social media and you're like, hey, do you want to be part of my focus groups, right? And then whoever answers, you sort of sort them from there, right? So that would be more of a convenience sample.
So the second group is convenient sample.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, essentially. I mean, in some anyway, let's not confuse it. Yes, I'm like, there are moments where you might snowball more people into your focus groups, but let's imagine that we don't, because that's just.
Sample is just like putting out an ad and like asking people to come.
And whoever kind of signs up, right? Essentially, you take whoever you can get. Right? It's whoever's convenient, which is in a lot of cases anyone willing to participate is who's convenient. All right. Okay. So, asking questions in a focus group. Similar to oh, sorry. Yeah. No, it's fine. Of course.
Convenient samples also have disadvantages.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so some of the advantages of a convenience sample is people are unlikely to know each other, right? And so some of the social dynamics that you would get from a natural group, right, where people might not be willing to speak, there might be pre-existing power hierarchies. Those wouldn't really be there in a convenience sample, right? Because you're just getting a fairly random assortment of people from the general population or from the group that you're interested in studying. And so none of those dynamics are going to exist generally, right? So they're much more open. You're much less likely to have like one kind of dominant group or people not saying things because they're worried about, will it get back to these other people, or I'm going to be punished for saying this because all these people know me, and if I'm too honest, right, they might ostracize me, or there are social consequences. With more perspectives, right, comes a little bit more variability. People might challenge each other's perspectives, right? You might have someone who is, say like, I'll think back to my Catholics, profoundly Catholic, right? Someone who's deeply, deeply Catholic. They're once a daily mass goer, and then other people who've been sort of traumatized by the church, and that interaction between those two different perspectives can bring out some really interesting things, whereas natural groups tend to be a little bit more monolithic. Disadvantages, there's definitely more work that you have to do in terms of screening people in a convenience sample, because you do want people that have a depth of knowledge, right? And you don't, how to put this kindly, you are at risk of getting sort of randos. Like people who are a little bit, maybe, I don't know how to say this, who might actually just want to disrupt what you're doing, right? They might have signed up, they have very strong opinions about something, but they might also be trying to sort of disrupt what you're doing, or their opinions are going to be so big that they actually are just there to kind of mouth off, right? And you don't have as much control over that, and it can be hard to screen for that. Like I've had to kick people out of focus groups and just be like, great, thanks. You're kind of like ranting and raving, and no one else is getting a chance to speak. So here's your $25. Get the hell out of here, right? I said it more kindly than that, but that's good. We've gotten everything from you we need. Why don't you here's your $25. Get out of here. So that, there's a little bit more randomness and a little bit more risk. In a natural group, you are going to tend to get more people that show up. In a convenience sample, it's incredibly variable. And yeah, again, you have to be really careful in screening. But I think those are like the main advantages, disadvantages. Does that kind of help? Okay. Other questions? Everyone's looking not in my direction. No one wants to make eye contact because no one. Okay. Oh wait, I didn't even talk about what's on this slide. I can't go forward. I have to stay here. Sorry. I honestly was up to like 1 a.m, like trying to read people's research questions and make semi-coherent comments about it. So if you get something that looks like Russian, I'm sorry. It's just like my brain might have switched at a point and just gone into Russian. Who knows anymore? It's that part of the semester. All right. So when you talk about like a focus group, right, you are going to be coming in with a script, right? Or a focus group guide, an interview guide of sorts. Expect, like compared to, say, an interview script for a semi-structured interview, expect this script to be much smaller, right? Because if you're talking to one person, I think it's reasonable that you could probably expect somewhere between 20 and 30 questions to be answered, because it's just that one person's perspective, and then you're probing your follow-up questions, right? The kind of natural flow of conversation. 20, probably a good number. In a focus group, right, because, and depending on the size, obviously, to include everyone's voices takes a lot more time. So like, I would say a maximum of maybe 10 questions is probably a good sort of guide. I guess if you come out of your first focus group and you feel like it didn't go well and those questions weren't enough, you increase the number, or you can have 10 main questions and a couple of like, backup questions. But it is a much longer process to get through a single question and include everyone's voices, right? So it's going to be I know it seems really straightforward. But it's going to be a much shorter script. Yeah, the amount of intervention by the moderator, right? And again, this is something that I think there's no really other way to do it than, some people are just really good at this, right? Some people have like a natural affinity for guiding a group discussion, right? Kindergarten teachers, probably the most skilled focus group facilitators ever, because they're good at directing absolute chaos and many voices that want to interrupt all the time. First grade teachers, also very good. So what you need to do as a moderator, right, in terms of how much you're going to intervene, the ideal is as little as possible. You're sort of guiding the discussion. You don't want things focused on you, right? You want people talking to each other and sort of building, and then you're just guiding the conversation and making sure everybody's voice gets heard, right? This is why I said last time, some people weren't here, I never sit at the head of the table, or even in the middle. Like I would never sit, if this was our table people are sitting at, I never sit here or there, or like right in the center on either side. I'm always like here, right off to the one side, so that I'm not the normal focal point of all the conversation. Because I just find then everybody talks to you. They're not talking to each other, they're talking to the moderator, and that's not necessarily what you want, right? Because then you're just doing like really short, bad interviews with like 10 people. So your job as the moderator is actually to speak as little as possible, to just sort of be a guide, to not offer your opinion. And yeah, you're gonna intervene basically to keep the conversation moving, right? If the conversation kind of runs dry, if one voice is dominating, you step in to sort of moderate that a little bit. And yeah, much of it's going to depend on the topic under discussion, how active people are being, if there are voices that are being heard too much or not enough, the goal of the research, and how much knowledge participants have, right? If they have a lot of knowledge, right, if something they know a lot about, you don't have to keep it moving as much. It tends to be pretty natural flow. If it's something like I think marketing research where people might not know as much, a focus group moderator is going to have to step in a lot more often to kind of keep things going. But there's, again, no hard and fast rules. It's a very intuitive process. You kind of have to figure it out as you go, or some people are magically good at it, and I can't explain why. Okay. Hang on. Okay. I just checking how much I have left here. So, limitations of focus groups. In terms of a focus group, you definitely have less control over the discussion than you would in an interview, right? Just because there's a lot of voices, you want to make sure that everyone's talking. There's a lot of perspectives going on at the same time. So it's not like, it's a little harder to redirect things, right? It's a little bit harder to say, like in an interview, you can ask really focused probing questions or follow-up questions. It's a lot harder in a focus group to kind of keep it moving in the direction that you might think is interesting. They are definitely hard. Is it herding cats? That's probably the appropriate metaphor, right? The discussion goes in all sorts of ways. The unwieldy amount of data can be produced. And it can be difficult to analyze. I said this last time, right? As much as I find interview transcribing nightmarish, focus group transcribing is nightmarish squared. Because there are so many voices going on. Sometimes people are jumping in and talking over each other. Hopefully as a moderator, you can limit that, right? And make sure everybody's speaking in turn. And most times people are pretty good about it. But these kinds of interruptions can be hard to analyze. Writing it down, like just transcribing focus groups is really difficult because most of the time you're doing it only with audio, right? You don't have video recording. And so it can be hard to know who's talking, right? And, even the best recording equipment can miss audio and things that people are saying if they aren't speaking clearly. So it can be really difficult to kind of analyze what's going on. Analyzing it is hard, right? Coding things based on person and keeping in mind, when you're coding, who said it, what their kind of personal context, like who are they, right? Who said it? Who are they? Like, are they a student? Are they a teacher? Like, what is going on? Who is the person that's speaking? And trying to make sense of that data can be really, really difficult. The personal traits, the dominant, quiet, always navigating the big voices and the little voices. Sometimes the people who are quiet and kind of subdued do have the most interesting things to say, right? They just have a hard time having their voices heard. So you want to make sure that they have that opportunity. Difficult when sensitive issues, social hierarchy, or strongly opposed positions. You could have people, and I've never actually had it happen to me, but you can have people get into a fight in your focus group, right? Where two people have really diametrically opposed opinions, and they're both big personalities, and they start going at it, right? They start arguing. And then, you got to defuse the argument and make sure it doesn't get into hurt feelings, because that's going to they might just keep going, like every point, so they started fighting on one point. And you're like, okay, you settled them down, you moved on to the next thing, and they just step into the next thing and they go right back at it, right? Because that's how people are. It's like, we weren't done our fight, Professor Broussard. So whatever question you ask next, we're going to pick up and do a fight again on there. So, that can be difficult to manage. Like I said, it's never happened to me, but certainly like in all the trainings, that I've seen, people talk about this. And this is like, sometimes it's like, okay, who needs a bathroom break? I need a bathroom break. Let's all just step outside. Let's here's some cigarettes. Let's go and smoke. I don't know if you smoke, but let's go have smoke or a coffee, take a 15-minute break, and hopefully when you come back, things will have settled themselves down. But it's difficult, right? Human beings are hard. People with different opinions. I mean, if you get into a really... I remember, I wasn't doing it because I was one of the only French speakers in the department. at U of C, so I got to do all the Quebecers, and all of the Quebecers all agreed on climate change. The people from Alberta and Saskatchewan, you had like hard environmentalists and climate deniers. And I understand that those conversations didn't always go very well, right? And those tables were extremely, extremely contentious. And it kind of derailed those conversations. Whereas I had smooth sailing because Quebecers were all like, yes, climate change, let's destroy Alberta's economy. That's all good. Like that was literally mostly the tone of it. Oh, and we're better than everyone else because they're Quebecers. What do you want? So, anyway, something to be aware of. It is difficult, and yeah, sometimes if you're in full control of your focus groups, you can stop and pause for breaks. If you're in a big one where there's like 52 focus groups going on, that can be much more difficult. Okay. Oh, online. This has definitely become a big thing. So, I love online interviews. I actually really like them. I like them much, much more than I like in-person interviews for a bunch of reasons. Well, let's talk. I'll say a couple things about interviews, and then we'll talk about online focus groups. Online focus groups are a disaster, a complete disaster. They do not work, but sometimes you have to do it. Okay, online interviews. One of the reasons they're really helpful is audio quality, right? And now like Zoom and Skype and everything. Like any kind of system, I don't know, I probably Google Meet. I never use it, but I'm sure it's there. Have audio recording built in, and most people's just their laptop or their phone has good enough audio quality that you're not going to miss a lot of audio and what they're saying. Now, there is the occasional thing where people disconnect, and that's annoying, but always fixable, right? Online interviews are great depending on the topic. One of the greatest things about it is you can save a lot of money and time doing online interviews in terms of travel time, right? And especially after COVID, everybody's sort of used to being on Zoom all the time anyway, so people don't really object to it. I was able to interview, when I did my PhD project, I was able to interview people in Britain, Russia, Latin America, LA, there's one other place, New York City. There were three Muscovites. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. There's one other he was in Thailand doing something crazy, right? So, I mean, aside from the fact that I had to do some of the interviews at like 2 a.m. local time, right? So I'm getting up and going down to my computer and doing an interview at 2 a.m. and it's like middle of the afternoon in Thailand. I'm like, cool, this is great. I'm super awake right now. This is, and the panic attack that comes from setting your alarm at like 1 a.m. because you have to be up and it's going to be hard, and worrying and not being able to get to sleep because you're like, am I going to wake up or am I going to miss this interview? I did not, but right, I was able to interview people all over the world from my basement, right, which is absolutely fabulous and one of the greatest things. And I got all of these interesting perspectives. So yeah, over geographic issues, great. Sensitive topics, it can also be good, right? Because, it's a little bit more distance, and not being in the room with someone can give people a little bit of emotional safety and space, and they can be in like a safe space for them, right? In their house or in their bedroom or whatever it happens to be. Visual biases can be reduced. Okay, so that's, for interviews. Let's talk about focus groups. The advantages, right? Usually smaller. It's less of an imposition for people to do something that's online, right? Like to get someone to say travel down to the university, like I said, on a Saturday, it is a bit of a burden for people, right? So the ease of access for people to just log on to Zoom and be in a focus group makes life pretty easy, right? So you can usually kind of more guarantee that people are going to attend, right? Even if they woke up 5 minutes before your focus group, right? Or they woke up 5 minutes after and they joined, it's not a big deal, right? Not a big deal because they just log in and they jump in and all of that fun stuff. So, smaller size and more control, several responses at once. It's easier actually now to kind of avoid this in online focus groups, right? Because you just mute people's mics, right? And you can have a lot of control as the sort of moderator. You can just like shut people down if they're interrupting people and just ask people to raise their hands and wait their turns. these kinds of things. And yeah, visual biases are reduced. One of the things that will tend to happen in these focus, like in-person focus groups, is people are always reading each other's body language, right? And that can actually cause people to sort of moderate their answers or not say things. But as we know from like being online, people are different a little bit when they're online. You can't, on Zoom, right? You don't necessarily see people's body language. You might see their face, but a lot of times people have cameras turned off. So it can reduce that kind of visual bias and make people more comfortable with speaking because they don't know how other people are reacting. A less reactive response to you as the moderator, right? Because they're not seeing you as much. They're maybe just seeing you, or you have your camera turned off. Although, as the moderator, you should probably keep your camera on, just generally. And yeah, they can do it at home, so they're in a safe space, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of advantages to it. Now, that said, do I have disadvantages? Yes, I'm sorry. I always get ahead of myself on slides. The other day in SOS 376, I had literally talked about something that was 3 slides forward because it's in my head and I don't need the slides, but they're kind of a guide. And then I forget that something's 3 slides ahead and I just talk about it and I get to the slide and I'm like, oh, well, I talked about this already. So there goes my pacing. All right. Problem. All right. Disadvantages, right? They can take longer, although even then your kind of time commitment, like in some ways, like one of the, I don't know, I shouldn't complain about this, but it's true. When you have to do things like set up a room, right? Set up a conference room to have people come in and do your focus group, that takes time, right? So it can, the interviews themselves can be longer, or the focus groups can be longer. Question or stretch? Okay, cool. Good times. Got to stay awake, keep that blood flowing, right? I gotcha. Yeah, it takes longer. The second point, though, I think is more important. It's a lot more difficult to establish rapport with people. And their rapport with you is really important, right? Like Zoom and these kinds of things are awkward, right? They are a little bit awkward. You're not in the same space. You can't read people's reactions as well. And I hate to say it, but like when it comes to good interviews and good focus groups, charisma is really important. Now you do have a question. All right. Well, now see, since I embarrassed you before, I got to take your question.
So then are online interviews more common now because I guess the effects of COVID?
They were already getting more common before too, but definitely COVID normalized it, right? Where some people wouldn't have understood online stuff before. Now everybody gets it, right? So yeah, they're much more common now, and people are much more comfortable with it as a format. Whereas before, some people were, like I would say more elderly people definitely weren't. They were like, "What's this Zoom? I don't understand what you're talking about." And like this, people didn't have the software, right? Now everybody sort of is comfortable with it. So definitely much more common, but I think they were getting more common before anyway. I think too, the other thing I'll say is I think podcasting has made this kind of online interviewing much more comfortable and common, because anyone who listens to podcasts, or watches them, it interacts with this all the time, right? So it seems much more normal for like 4 faces to be on a screen in that kind of Zoom grid just staring at each other. So yeah, I think a lot of stuff, people just get less weirded out by it over time. Gen Z is definitely like, oh, whatever, yeah, this is the best way. I have my own snacks and everything. Although it's like, one of the problems is definitely you can't identify distracted participants, and people might be doing other things instead of paying attention to your focus group. Like checking their email, or who knows, right? Let's not use our imaginations too much on what people might be doing during your focus group. See, I said don't use your imagination, which causes you to use your imagination, which is bad. Okay. So I mean, rapport is harder to establish, right? You're not there, and you're not being super charming and wonderful and offering people coffee and being, greeting them at the door, right? They're popping in and you're, it's awkward. We know Zoom. More difficult. It can be more difficult to probe, and definitely, they are just these more stilted conversations, right? It's like people have to raise their hand and it's a little hand icon. If you're not paying attention, you can miss it. There's all sorts of problems with kind of flow. The flow isn't always great. So I honestly, I guess I've not done online focus groups. I'm imagining things. I'm imagining things from like online faculty meetings. I hate online faculty meetings. They are the worst. That is what I'm going to say. Yeah, higher non-response, right? If people aren't, I see your question. People aren't paying attention, right? Then people may just not answer. They might not have been following the flow of the conversation. Their cat came in, or they went away to the bathroom to pee and they missed part of the conversation, right? And so they just might not want to answer and might not know what to say. Yeah, go ahead.
When you're doing like Zoom groups, do you make it that everyone has to have their camera on, or is it kind of like off, or you choose?
I think you as the moderator have to kind of pick. I think inherently people are going to be, this is my experience with students anyway, more comfortable if they're able to turn their cameras off, right? Obviously, right? Because then, you don't see everything they're doing and you're not looking into their bedroom or whatever space they're in. But it definitely makes it really, really hard as the moderator to know what's going on with everybody, who's doing what, are they paying attention? Do you need to refocus them? Do people need a break, right? It gets to be really hard if you don't have that visual. You can't really see what people are doing. So you might want to be like, hey, can we all just keep our cameras on? But then you might have people who get a little upset about that, right? And you can't, in a sense, you can't really control it. Like you can, I know in Zoom, you can be like, request camera turn on, but it's their choice, right? You can't force turn their camera on because that would be super creepy. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I mean, you'd have to decide what you want to stress and then sort of be okay if people are like, no, I'm not doing that, right? Yeah, moderator can't read body language. That's a big one, right? You can't even get a sense when people are getting tired, right? And need a break or something's upsetting someone, right? You can read a lot of body language just naturally. Most people are good at it. Anyway, and yeah, people can disconnect accidentally and have trouble getting back in. And so this can create technical issues, right? Technical issues are a pain in the butt because then you're like, oh, I'm just trying to get Joe back in here. Hang on, and then, you lose the flow of a conversation too, because you got an email from this person like, I can't get back in. What's the password? Right. And then you're distracted for a sec. Some of that can be handled by like moderators, right? If you have people helping you, some of that can happen, but some of the problems are unavoidable, right? If you can't see people's faces, you can't read their body language. Okay. So in general, like focus groups and interviews, why would you do this over ethnography? Now, I'm sure a lot of ethnographers would be like, Dr. Broussard, or you idiot, whatever they would call me. You don't need to make this distinction between, interviewing and ethnography. And this is true, right? Because a lot of times interviewing is part of ethnography. So it's not, just don't think of it as like a clear, bright line that you have to do one or the other. But what are the advantages, say, of interviewing over ethnography or other approaches, right? It's better kind of for seeing through the eyes of other people, right? You're getting their perspective, right? They're telling you how they see the world, right? Rather than you, say, being in an ethnography and being like, I think Mary thinks this, right? Based on how she's acting, you're asking Mary, what do you think, right? And she's going to tell you, or why did you do that? Why did you say that? What's your opinion? All of that stuff, right? Better for learning the native language, right? So how people talk, like what is the way people talk about these things? What's the language they're using? What are the terms they're using? What are their feelings, right? Their own sort of kind of perspectives and the way they speak about things you can get in interviews in a way that you can't get necessarily in other contexts. Can discover things that are taken for granted. Often, the way people talk about things, you'll just sort of realize what people's assumptions are, right? Especially in focus groups, right? If you have a group of people that share the same assumptions and you're a kind of outsider to that group, it can be really interesting because all of a sudden you're like, oh, weird. Like they all sort of take this idea for granted, right? They all sort of view things the same way. And so, you can see that. Or sometimes, in someone challenging someone's perspective, you can see what both people kind of take for granted. Better at uncovering deviant or hidden activities. People may be, obviously people might tell you about things in an interview that you might not be able to observe in an ethnography, right? Like if you're interested in the sex habits of furries, right? People will probably tell you that. The chances that you're going to be able to observe that is relatively low, I think, hopefully. So deviant hidden activities or crimes that they are committing, right? It might be hard for you to observe your gang members doing a crime, but they might tell you about the crimes they've committed. It's more naturalistic, right? You're not there in the space, kind of disrupting things, right? So you're just hearing about it from people. Of course, you can get that social desirability bias, but it's still pretty naturalistic. And the context, people can tell you why they did something, right? Sometimes you might have observed a behavior that someone did, but you don't know why. And they can kind of tell you what was the context for, why you behaved in that particular way. Okay. Michaela.
I think the slide that says advantages of ethnography over should be the other way around, I think.
Yes, I'm sorry. Okay. Maybe I got those backwards. I read my own slide wrong. Uh-oh. I don't think that... Yeah, that should be the other way around. Sorry. Okay. Yes, we were talking just about the advantages of interviewing. I got that one wrong. These are all advantages of interviewing over ethnography. I just typoed a typo. So, interviews, right? Again, some issues are not observable. Frequency of criminal behavior, right? So things that you can't see, uncovering kind of some behaviors you can get. Yeah, please.
Sorry, I'm confused with what got Uber.
I think both slides should be advantages of interviewing over ethnography. So just reverse those two terms, right? Okay. That's a typo because my brain is stupid.
So they're both advantages?
Yes, we were just talking about interviews over ethnography here. It's just that my brain is dumb. I don't have disadvantages at all. Okay. Wow, it's later than I thought. Okay. Qualitative interviewing over ethnography. Some things that people will tell you about things that you couldn't see, right? Because they won't tell you. Past events. Definitely an advantage of kind of qualitative interviewing over ethnography is that if you weren't there, you can't see things that happened in the past, but people can tell you what happened in the past, right? And they can tell you what they're going to do in the future, right? I robbed the liquor store yesterday. I'm going to rob the liquor store tomorrow. Or anything, right? Basically, people in telling you things can tell you about the past, and they can also tell you about what they plan to do in the future. They are less intrusive. Obviously. Longitudinal research is easier. That is definitely something. You can revisit someone and interview them again multiple times, right? So if you want to, and this is the project that we're working on in the CCR, by we, I mean not me. I'm just coordinating reservations and stuff. My boss is doing it, right? They're going to re-interview people. They're going to interview them in prison. They're going to interview them 2 weeks after release, 2 months after release, and a year after release, if they last that long. Many of them won't. It's easier to do that than to say follow them around or be ethnographic with them for that amount of time, right? And you can cover a lot more ground and a lot more people. Greater breadth of topics can be covered, right? An ethnography limits you to, only what you can observe in the moment. Whereas, you can ask people any number of questions about any number of subjects as long as they're willing to talk. Address specific issues, things that might not come up in ethnographic observation. You can ask them about things that you don't observe directly, right? Okay, I think is that my last slide? Yes, that is my last slide. It is 12:09. We have 11 minutes, and I have slides for content analysis. Do you want to start, or do you just want you were the first to shake your head, or do you just want to go 11 minutes early and get a cup of coffee? And okay, all right. Then Thursday we will start on content analysis. Do I want to keep my doodles? No. Okay, because I doodle on the slides. All right. Then by the vote of 3 people, because no one else was brave enough to say, I don't want to be here anymore, which I can understand. By the vote of 3 people, you are dismissed. Off you go. We'll come back on Thursday. Again, remember, we have lab today and tomorrow, depending on which lab you're in. I gave you feedback on Mini Lab 4, so have a look at it. And you'll need it for Mini Lab 5 and all of that fun stuff. And I will get you your major labs back sometime, probably before the end of the semester or this week. My goal is this week. All right. Peace out. Chloe.
Hi,
Hi.
I have a question.
Or Chloe.
Please don't do that. Okay, we'll do that. Okay, so very valid feedback because I did have no research question because I had
Okay.
no idea how to write it.
Okay.
So I came up with something because I want to look at the double burden specifically of single mothers.
Okay.
Is that more of a research question?
Yes. I would say, like, how do single mothers experience double burden?
Yes,
Right?
like how they cope with the struggles of a double
Of a double burden.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah?
You got it.
Sweet. Okay, perfect.
That was easy. Howdy.
Sorry, I know you said this like 3 times, but
I will not say it again. Get out of here. Yeah, it's fine.
so all of these points are advantages of qualitative over ethnography. Like I didn't understand what the typo was.
Oh, I said here, like, these should be reversed.
Okay.
Yeah.
And all of these points fall in.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's no disadvantage or flow.
Correct.
Thank you.
Howdy.
I was just wondering, I wasn't here on Thursday,
Yes.
but there's no recording posted.
Oh, did I forget? It's there. I think the audio is a little spotty because my microphone cut out.
Okay.
I will post it on there. You can always just go to the YouTube channel and under the live tab, they're all there, even if I haven't put it in the playlist yet,
Okay.
because I make
Okay.
them all public. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah, if I ever miss one, because sometimes, and usually I organize them all on Friday, but this Friday I had exams in my 2 other classes, and so I was like, walking on sunshine, no lecturing, and I didn't do it because I'd already done those classes because they were organized so people could get, and I forgot
Right,
the Thursday
yeah,
one.
yeah.
I can do it now. Hang on, it'll take me 2 seconds probably.
Okay.
One problem with YouTube, actually, the problem with using, actually I should shut OBS.